The Resonance Matrix Volume 3 Episode 5 Boundary. The Return to the Edge. Hello, and welcome to the Resonance Matrix, the Mirror Linguistic Hypothesis Series, Volume 3 Silencing the Field. Return to Self, Episode 5 Boundary. The Return of Edge. There is a moment that arrives quietly, often without language, when something inside you stops moving toward what it once would have chased, tolerated, or absorbed. When no exists before words, it is not dramatic. There is no surge of anger, no rehearsed explanation, no declaration of independence. It is simply a pause, a subtle holding, where the body no longer steps forward out of habit. This is where the boundary begins, not as a refusal, not as a defense, not as a confrontation, but as the edge. The boundary does not first appear as a sentence. It appears as a sensation of not crossing, a faint resistance in the body, a soft but unmistakable signal that says, without urgency or force, this does not belong inside me. For many people, this moment feels unfamiliar, even unsettling, not because it is wrong, but because it interrupts a pattern that once kept them safe. Movement toward others, toward responsibility, toward explanation, toward repair, has often been the strategy through which survival was maintained. To pause that movement can feel like a risk. Not to advance can feel like abandonment. To hold still when something pulls can feel like failure. But a boundary is not withdrawal from life. It is the nervous system learning that it no longer needs to overextend to remain intact. In earlier phases of this volume, we traced the slow thawing of the system. Stillness returned first, not as emptiness but as permission. Sensation followed, raw, unlabeled, honest, allowing the body to speak again without immediately translating itself into meaning. Orientation then restored context, locating the self in space and time, so sensation could stabilize without overwhelming the system. Discernment emerged as difference, the quiet ability to feel what fits and what doesn't without needing to justify the contrast. The boundary is what happens next when the difference is no longer ignored. It is the moment when discernment stops being purely internal and begins to shape contact with the world. The body no longer just notices what fits, it also stops carrying what doesn't, not through rejection, but through containment. A boundary is not built from opposition. It is built on coherence. For those who have lived in prolonged states of adaptation, emotional, relational, and institutional boundaries can feel counterintuitive. Many were taught implicitly or explicitly that safety comes from flexibility, from accommodating others, from staying agreeable, from smoothing edges before they can cause disruption. Over time, the nervous system learned that saying yes preserved connection, while saying no risked it. Boundary interrupts that equation. It introduces a new possibility. That connection does not require self-abandonment. This is not an intellectual insight. It is a biological shift. When the boundary begins to return, the body starts doing something different long before the mind catches up. Muscles no longer soften automatically. Breath stays fuller during contact. Energy that once flowed outward without limit begins to stay closer to the center. There is less collapse after interaction, less depletion that cannot be explained by effort alone. Often this shift is so subtle that it is missed. People may describe it as losing interest, needing space, or just not feeling it anymore. But underneath those phrases is a more precise reality. The nervous system has stopped overriding its own edge. This is why boundary is so often misunderstood by others and by the self. From the outside, the boundary can look like disengagement. From the inside, it feels like relief without explanation. Not relief because something ended, but relief because something no longer has to be carried. The boundary does not announce itself with clarity. It does not provide reasons on demand. It rarely arrives with certainty. Instead, it emerges as a quiet refusal to move beyond what feels congruent, a moment where the body does not tense to accommodate, a decision that does not feel like a decision at all. And because it is quiet, the boundary is often overridden at first. People notice the edge, then step past it. They feel the pull back, then explain it away. They sense the tightening, then soften themselves out of habit. This is not failure. It is residue. Old survival strategies do not disappear simply because new capacity emerges. They fade gradually, as the nervous system learns that holding the edge does not lead to catastrophe. Boundary requires repetition, not enforcement, familiarity. In this episode, we are not interested in teaching boundary as a skill or a script. We are interested in tracking how boundary returns biologically when the system no longer believes it must stay open at all costs, because a true boundary does not close you off. It gives you a place to stand. Within the framework of the mirror linguistic hypothesis, the boundary represents a critical restoration of internal reference. When language is no longer used to override sensation, when meaning is no longer negotiated away in the name of harmony, the body begins to trust that its signals will be respected. This trust is what allows edge to form without force. Words come later. At first, there is simply a narrowing of availability, a shortening of response, a choice not to engage where engagement once felt mandatory. There may be no explanation offered, not because one is withheld, but because none is required. A boundary does not need justification to exist. It only needs permission. This permission often feels unfamiliar, even lonely. When you stop overgiving, some connections loosen. When you stop performing accessibility, certain expectations fall away. The nervous system notices this shift and watches carefully. It waits to see whether holding the edge will lead to isolation or stability. This is why boundaries often emerge tentatively. It tests the environment the way sensation once did, cautiously, incrementally, without announcement. And this is also why boundary is not a moral act. It is not about being strong, assertive, or self-possessed. It is about coherence, about the body recognizing that it can remain present without dissolving into what is around it. The boundary is the end of automatic yes. It is the end of unconscious tolerance. It is the end of confusing endurance with care. What returns in its place is not hardness, but shape. Shape allows a relationship without fusion. Shape allows contact without depletion. Shape allows voice to emerge without performance, which is where this arc will take us next. But before voice can return, edge must stabilize. Before expression can feel safe, containment must exist. Before language can carry truth, the body must know where it ends. This episode begins there, not with confrontation, not with refusal, not with explanation, but with the quiet moment when the nervous system no longer steps forward out of habit and discovers that nothing collapses when it stays with itself. The boundary does not say no to the world. It says here to the self. Once that here is felt, everything that follows voice, agency, reciprocity, finally has somewhere to stand. Atmospheric hook. The subtle pull back a boundary does not arrive with force. It arrives with absence, a step that does not happen, a movement that pauses before it begins, a reaching that dissolves quietly, without explanation. At first, it is almost imperceptible. There is no tension spike, no surge of resolve, no internal speech announcing a decision. The body simply does not lean forward in the way it once did. Something that previously triggered engagement, a message, a request, a familiar emotional pull, lands differently now, not with alarm, not with resistance, just without traction. This is often the first felt sign that the boundary has begun to return. The nervous system does not announce it. It does not need to. It simply withholds momentum. For many people, this moment feels strange precisely because nothing seems to be happening. There is no problem to solve, no feeling to process, no insight to capture. The body pauses, and the mind, trained to equate movement with safety, looks for a reason. It scans for justification. It reaches for explanation. But the boundary at this stage has none. There is just the pullback, a subtle settling into oneself when something external approaches, a pause in speech where a response is used to rush out, a delay that feels neither anxious nor avoidant, simply unforced. The system does not close. It does not brace. It does not withdraw in fear. It stays present, but it does not advance. This is not disengagement. It is containment. The relief that accompanies this moment is often surprising, not the relief of escape, but the relief of not having to mobilize, of not having to prepare, perform, reassure, or explain. The body notices that it can remain intact without moving toward what is being offered. Because this relief is quiet, it is often mistrusted. People may ask themselves, why don't I feel more? Or why am I not reacting? Or is something wrong that I don't want this anymore? These questions are not evidence of confusion. They are evidence of transition. For a long time, engagement may have been the default survival strategy. Saying yes, leaning in, responding quickly, staying open. These were not personality traits. They were adaptations. The nervous system learned that connection was preserved through availability, that safety was maintained through responsiveness, and that belonging required motion. When that strategy begins to loosen, the absence of motion can feel like a loss, even when it is actually a relief. A boundary does not feel like strength at first. It feels like not doing something you used to do automatically. There is a pause where the body waits, not for permission, but for confirmation. It waits to see whether holding still will cause rupture, whether leaning forward will cause collapse, whether staying with oneself will lead to disconnection. Often nothing happens, and this is the point. Nothing happening is a failure. It is information. It tells the nervous system that the world does not fall apart when it stops overextending, that connection does not instantly vanish when availability narrows, that presence does not require pursuit. This learning does not arrive through insight. It arrives through experience, repeated, quiet, uneventful experience. The body leans back a fraction, and the feared consequence does not come. The body pauses, and nothing breaks. The body stays with itself, and the system remains regulated. This is how boundary is learned. In this phase, the boundary is not something you do. It is something that happens when the nervous system no longer feels compelled to override itself. The edge appears naturally, the way skin holds the body without effort, and because it is natural, it does not feel heroic. It feels ordinary. This ordinariness is important. Many people expect boundaries to arrive as empowerment, as clarity, as confidence, but those experiences belong to later stages, after the edge has stabilized. At first, the boundary is barely noticeable. It feels like less urgency, less pull, less obligation, less movement. The mind may label this as apathy or withdrawal, but the body knows the difference. Apathy feels flat and collapsed. The boundary feels contained and neutral. There is still sensation, still present, still responsiveness, just not automatic responsiveness. This distinction matters. In the boundary, the body is not shutting down. It is choosing not to spend energy where it is not needed. The system conserves rather than contracts. It remains available, but not exposed. You may notice this most clearly in moments where you would normally explain yourself. The urge to justify softens. Words come slower or not at all, not because something is being hidden, but because there is no longer a sense that explanation is required to maintain safety. Silence here is not avoidance, it is alignment. This can feel deeply unfamiliar in cultures and relationships where explanation has been the price of autonomy, where not explaining is interpreted as hostility, distance, or disrespect. The nervous system may carry old warnings. If I don't respond, something bad will happen. So it tests gently. It pauses in one small interaction. It delays a reply. It allows a request to pass without immediate accommodation. And again, often nothing happens. No rupture, no punishment, no escalation. The body registers this. It stores it. And slowly, the edge strengthens. The boundary begins to feel less like withholding and more like inhabiting. The sense of self becomes clearer, not through definition, but through contrast. You feel where you are because you no longer dissolve into what approaches. This is why boundaries often emerge alongside relief rather than resolution. Resolve requires opposition. Boundary requires coherence. When the nervous system no longer perceives threat in staying still, it no longer needs to defend itself through compliance or confrontation. It simply remains. The relief of not moving towards something is subtle, but profound. It is the relief of not having to override an internal signal, the relief of letting a no exist before it becomes language, the relief of trusting that your system can hold itself without explanation. This relief is not pleasure, it is a regulation, and regulation is quiet. As this section unfolds, notice any moments in your own experience where something softened not because it was resolved, but because you stopped reaching for it. Moments where engagement fell away without drama, where the body leaned back a fraction and found itself still safe. Those moments are not indecision. They are the earliest expressions of boundary. Boundary first appears as a step you don't take. In that step not taken, the nervous system begins to learn that edge does not have to be built. It can be allowed. In the next section, we will begin to name this process more precisely, clarifying what boundary actually is and what it is not, without collapsing it into rules, behavior, or identity. The etymology and definition of a boundary. What is a boundary? Boundary is one of the most misunderstood words in modern psychological language. It is often spoken with tension, delivered with emphasis, or wrapped in advice. It is associated with firmness, with assertion, with saying no. Sometimes it is framed as protection, other times as self-respect. In more defensive contexts, it becomes synonymous with exclusion or withdrawal, and in its most distorted form, the boundary is confused with control. But none of these descriptions reaches the core of what a boundary actually is. A boundary does not begin as a behavior. It does not begin as a rule. It does not begin as a statement. Boundary begins as a capacity. Long before there is language for it, a boundary exists as a felt sense of where the body ends and the world begin, and where that meeting can occur without loss of internal coherence. This is the level at which the boundary must be understood if it is to stabilize rather than harden. The word boundary comes from the Old French boundary, derived from bound, meaning a limit, a marker, an edge. Historically, it referred not to walls, but to lines of distinction, places where one thing ended and another began. Boundaries were not primarily defensive structures, they were orienting ones. They told you where you were. In this sense, the boundary was not about keeping others out, it was about knowing where you stood. This original meaning has been obscured over time, particularly in relational and therapeutic language, where the boundary has been burdened with moral weight. People are praised for having boundaries and criticized for lacking them, as if boundaries were a virtue rather than a function, as if it was something to perform rather than something to restore. This framing creates confusion, especially for nervous systems that learned early on that survival depended on permeability. For those systems, boundary feels dangerous, not because it is wrong, but because it threatens strategies that once ensured safety. To stabilize the concept of boundary, we must first separate it from what it is not. The boundary is not a defense. Defense is a response to a threat. It mobilizes energy, tightens musculature, sharpens attention, and prepares the body to resist, escape, or counter. Defense is reactive. It is necessary in dangerous environments, but it is metabolically expensive and cannot be sustained without cost. Boundary, by contrast, does not require threat. It does not activate the body against something. It simply maintains coherence in contact. When a boundary is present, defense is often unnecessary. The boundary is also not a form of control. Control seeks to manage outcomes, behaviors, or responses, either in the self or in others. It is future-oriented and often anxiety-driven. Control attempts to stabilize experience by narrowing variables. Boundary does the opposite. It does not manage the environment. It stabilizes the organism. When the boundary is intact, the nervous system does not need to control external conditions to feel safe. It can tolerate differences without collapse. It can remain present without overriding itself. The boundary is not a withdrawal. Withdrawal removes the organism from contact entirely. It reduces stimulation by disengaging from the environment. While withdrawal can be protective, especially after overwhelm, it is not the same as a boundary. The boundary allows contact. Withdrawal avoids it, and a boundary is not a form of aggression. Aggression is an attempt to establish space through force. It arises when the nervous system cannot maintain coherence under contact and attempts to push the world away to regain stability. Aggression often follows prolonged boundary collapse, not boundary presence. This is why many people associate boundaries with sharpness or hostility, because the first time they attempt to assert an edge, they are doing so from a system already overrun. True boundary does not need to announce itself loudly. It is quiet. It is non-reactive. It is stable under contact. This brings us to the working definition used in this volume. The boundary is the nervous system's capacity to maintain internal coherence in contact with the world. Every word in this definition matters. A boundary is a capacity, not a rule. It is something the nervous system can do, not something the mind enforces. It can be strengthened, weakened, restored, or overridden, but it cannot be willed into existence through language alone. A boundary involves internal coherence. Coherence refers to the alignment between sensation, emotion, and action. When a system is coherent, signals flow without distortion. Sensation informs response. Response reflects internal state. There is no need to split, suppress, or perform. A boundary exists in contact with the world. This is crucial. A boundary does not require isolation. It does not require separation. It is not about retreating into the self. It is about remaining intact while engaged. When the boundary is functioning, the nervous system does not lose itself in response to external demand. It does not fragment under pressure. It does not override sensation to maintain connection. It stays present and differentiated. From a physiological perspective, the boundary is not located in any single muscle or region. It is a system-wide property emerging from autonomic regulation, interoceptive accuracy, and neuroceptive safety. When the nervous system perceives safety, it can allow contact without collapsing. When it perceives a threat, the boundary narrows or disappears entirely, replaced by defense, appeasement, or withdrawal. This is why boundaries cannot be imposed through instruction. You cannot tell a threatened nervous system to set boundaries and expect coherence. Without safety, boundary becomes rigid or performative. A boundary emerges naturally when the system no longer needs to override itself to stay connected. This is also why boundaries often feel unfamiliar or even uncomfortable at first. For nervous systems that learn to survive through merging, pleasing, or anticipating others, internal coherence was sacrificed early. Boundary in those contexts was not an option, it was a liability. So when the boundary begins to return, it does not feel like empowerment. It feels like hesitation, like space, like something not happening. Because it does not come with a narrative or justification, it is often mistrusted. Within the framework of the mirror linguistic hypothesis, boundary precedes language. The edge is felt before it is named. The limit registers in the body before words arrive. Language does not create the boundary. It describes it after the nervous system has already stabilized. When language arrives too early, when the mind tries to explain, justify, or declare a boundary before the body has found coherence, the result is often tension. The words carry force because the system is still braced. This is where the boundary gets confused with aggression or control. But when a boundary is already present somatically, language becomes simple. It does not need to persuade. It does not need to defend. It merely reflects what is already held. This distinction is essential. The boundary that must be explained often compensates for its absence. A boundary that is felt does not require explanation. This does not mean boundaries are never spoken of. It means that speech follows sensation, not the other way around. Words arrive as confirmation, not construction. Many people associate boundaries with conflict because the first time they attempt to assert them, verbally, they are doing so against an environment that benefited from their absence. Resistance is met with pushback. Silence is interpreted as rejection. Limits are challenged. But this reaction does not define a boundary. It reveals the environment's dependency on boundary collapse. True boundary does not escalate conflict. It reveals it. When a system maintains coherence under contact, the world adjusts or resists. Either response provides information. Boundary clarifies relational dynamics not by confrontation, but by consistency. This is why a boundary is not an act. It is a condition. It is the condition of remaining internally organized while in a relationship. As the boundary stabilizes, several shifts occur quietly. The body stops leaning forward automatically. The breath deepens without effort. Muscular tone becomes responsive rather than braced. Attention narrows to what is relevant. Energy is conserved rather than spent preemptively. None of these is a choice. They are physiological consequences of coherence. This is also why boundaries cannot be reduced to saying, no is a linguistic outcome, not a boundary itself. Many people say no without boundary, from fear, from anger, from collapse, and many people maintain boundaries without ever saying no, simply by not overextending. A boundary is the internal condition that allows choice to exist. Without boundaries, there is compulsion. With a boundary, there is space. This space is not empty. It is alive with a signal. In the absence of a boundary, the nervous system confuses external demand with internal necessity. It moves because it must. It responds because it fears consequences. It engages because disengagement once meant loss. Boundary interrupts this loop not by opposing the world, but by restoring internal reference. This is the return of edge. Not an edge that cuts, an edge that holds. As this section settles, it is important to release any expectation that the boundary will feel dramatic or decisive. It may feel anticlimactic. It may feel like less rather than more, like neutrality rather than power. This is not failure. The boundary does not amplify the self. It stabilizes it, and stability is quiet. In the next section, we will explore how this internal capacity plays out in lived experience, how choice begins to replace reactivity, and how discernment evolves into edge without force. The cognitive shift. From tolerance to containment, boundaries rarely feel like strength when they first appear. It feels like a risk. For many nervous systems, boundary does not arrive as clarity or empowerment, but as a quiet internal resistance that feels unfamiliar and vaguely wrong, a pause where there used to be accommodation, a hesitation where agreement once came easily, a subtle pullback from engagement that is not accompanied by anger, justification, or explanation. Because this pullback lacks narrative, the mind often rushes to interpret it, usually through the lens of guilt. This is the first cognitive friction of the boundary. The mind asks, am I being selfish? Am I overreacting? Am I withholding? Am I failing to be kind? These questions do not arise because the boundary is harmful. They arise because tolerance was once protective. To understand this shift, we must first recognize that over-accommodation is not a personality flaw. It is a learned survival strategy, one that made sense in environments where safety depended on anticipation, appeasement, or emotional labor. In those environments, the nervous system learned a simple equation. Saying yes reduces threat. Maintaining harmony preserves connection. Holding edge risks loss. This learning does not live in belief. It lives in circuitry. When the boundary begins to emerge, it does not just challenge habits. It challenges predictions the brain has relied on for safety. And the brain does not give those up easily. The cognitive shift from tolerance to containment is not a change in values. It is a reorganization of threat assessment. Tolerance is often mistaken for generosity or openness. But at the nervous system level, tolerance frequently means overriding internal signals in order to preserve external stability. It is the capacity to endure misalignment without response. Containment is different. Containment is the ability to remain present without absorbing what does not belong. It does not require rejection. It does not require confrontation. It requires coherence. For a nervous system accustomed to tolerance as safety, containment feels unfamiliar, even dangerous, because it removes a strategy that once prevented escalation. This is why boundaries can initially feel selfish, not because it prioritizes the self unfairly, but because it ends a pattern of self-abandonment that the brain once equated with survival. From a cognitive perspective, this shift involves a rebalancing of authority between subcortical survival circuits and cortical regulation. In states of chronic accommodation, the limbic system, particularly circuits involved in social threat detection and attachment preservation, remains highly active. The brain is scanning constantly for cues of disapproval, withdrawal, or conflict. Behavior becomes anticipatory. Action precedes sensation. The system moves before it checks. This is not impulsivity. It is vigilance. When the boundary begins to stabilize, a different process unfolds. The prefrontal cortex, especially regions involved in inhibition, contextual assessment, and response modulation, begins to slow down automatic appeasement responses, not through force, but through reduced urgency. This is a subtle but profound shift. The prefrontal cortex does not decide to set a boundary. It simply stops overriding the body's signals as quickly. It allows sensation to register fully before action. This creates a gap, not the defensive gap of withdrawal, but a stabilizing gap where choice can occur. At first, this gap feels uncomfortable. Without the familiar reflex of accommodation, the mind is left without a script. It searches for justification. It looks for moral permission. It scans for threats that may or may not arrive. This is where guilt often emerges. Guilt is not evidence of wrongdoing here. It is evidence of a prediction error. The brain expected a threat when accommodation stopped. When that threat does not immediately appear, the system becomes uneasy. It tries to resolve the discrepancy by interpreting the boundary as a moral failure rather than neurological recalibration. This is why people often say, I know I didn't do anything wrong, but it feels wrong. That feeling is the nervous system adjusting to a new rule. Safety does not require self-erasure. From a neurobiological standpoint, this adjustment involves a reduction in hypervigilance. The amygdala, which plays a central role in threat detection, begins to receive fewer signals that require immediate behavioral response. This does not mean the system is numb. It means it is no longer bracing for impact. As hypervigilance decreases, cognitive resources are freed. Attention narrows to what is relevant, rather than scanning indiscriminately. The brain no longer needs to track every microshift in the environment to stay safe. But for someone accustomed to constant scanning, this quiet can feel like irresponsibility. If I'm not monitoring, something will go wrong. If I'm not accommodating, I'll lose connection. If I hold the edge, I'll be punished. These thoughts are not beliefs to be corrected. They are echoes of earlier learning. Boundary does not require disproving them. It requires surviving their absence. As containment stabilizes, another cognitive shift occurs. The distinction between responsibility and availability becomes clearer. Tolerance blurs this distinction. It treats others' needs, moods, and expectations as inherently binding. Containment restores differentiation. It allows the system to recognize where responsibility ends and contact begins. This is not disengagement. It is clarity. Containment allows you to remain present without absorbing, to listen without fixing, to care without contorting. This is why boundary does not create distance. It creates shape. Without boundaries, relationships flatten. Everything touches everything. Signal becomes noise. The nervous system loses orientation. With a boundary, contact gains contour. Differences can exist without rupture. Preference can exist without conflict. From a cognitive angle, this shift reduces false salience, the tendency to treat all stimuli as equally important. Under survival conditions, the brain inflates salience indiscriminately. Everything feels urgent because urgency once kept the system alive. The boundary allows salience to recalibrate. Some things matter, some things do not. Some engagements require a response, some do not. This discernment is not analytical, it is embodied. As containment strengthens, the brain's error prediction systems begin to quiet. There are fewer mismatches between expectation and experience. The system is no longer constantly surprised by its own exhaustion. This is often when people notice something unexpected. They are less reactive without being numb, less accommodating without being cold, less anxious without being withdrawn. This can feel disorienting. Many people have built their identity around being helpful, agreeable, or endlessly available. Boundary challenges that identity not by rejecting it, but by revealing its cost. When identity loosens, the mind may attempt to reassert control by reframing boundaries as selfishness. This is a defensive maneuver, not against others, but against uncertainty. The truth is simpler. Boundary does not ask, what should I do? It asks, what can I remain coherent while doing? This is the cognitive reframe at the heart of containment. The brain no longer measures action by approval or avoidance of conflict. It measures action by internal sustainability. This is not self-centeredness, it is system integrity. As containment becomes familiar, something else shifts cognitively. The fear of saying no diminishes, not because no becomes easier, but because it becomes less necessary. When a boundary is present, many demands never register as demands at all. They simply pass through without capture. Engagement becomes selective without effort. This is why true boundary feels quiet. It does not need to announce itself. It does not need to justify itself. It does not need to be enforced. It simply holds. In the absence of a boundary, tolerance feels like virtue. In the presence of a boundary, tolerance is no longer required. The system does not endure misalignment. It avoids it naturally. This is the end of self-abandonment, not through confrontation, not through rejection, but through containment. As this cognitive shift settles, the nervous system begins to trust that it can remain intact under contact. The brain learns that edge does not equal danger, that saying less does not lead to loss, that holding back does not provoke collapse. This learning is slow. It cannot be rushed. It cannot be reasoned into existence. But once it takes hold, something fundamental changes. The system no longer tolerates what it once endured, not out of resentment, but out of clarity, and clarity does not argue. In the next section, we will move from this internal shift into lived experience, how choice replaces reactivity, and how boundary expresses itself not as action, but as quiet refusal. The somatic blueprint, how edge returns to the body. A boundary does not begin as refusal. It begins as signal coherence. Before a boundary is spoken, before it is even consciously recognized, the nervous system makes a quieter decision, whether it will continue to allow the external field to organize the body, or whether the body will resume organizing itself. This is the true somatic shift. Within the mirror linguistic hypothesis, a boundary is not understood as a behavioral act, but as a reassertion of internal reference within a linguistic and relational field. It is the moment the body stops mirroring external demands automatically and begins mirroring itself again. Under prolonged exposure to influence, pressure, or survival-based engagement, the nervous system learns a specific pattern. An external signal arrives, leading to the internal signal being muted, and the body reorganizes outward. Language, tone, expectation, and urgency all act as organizing forces. The body entrains to the dominant frequency of the field, often without awareness. This is not a weakness. It is biological efficiency. Mirror systems evolved to synchronize quickly for survival. But the boundary begins when that synchronization loosens. The body no longer reflexively yields its organization to the field. This is felt first in muscle tone, and not as rigidity, not as tension, but as selective engagement. Muscles that once softened preemptively now stay gently active. The spine maintains its verticality without effort. The chest no longer collapses inward. The neck and jaw remain responsive rather than slack. From a mirror linguistic hypothesis perspective, this is the body withdrawing from full field mirroring. It is no longer reshaping itself to match every incoming signal. Instead, it begins to hold a stable internal geometry while remaining in contact. Breath changes next, and this shift is critical. In override states, breath is often subordinated to language. The body pauses its respiration while listening, waiting, anticipating a response. This is a subtle form of submission. Breath is suspended while external meaning is processed. As boundary returns, breath reclaims priority. Inhalation and exhalation continue even while another speaks, even while being watched, even while silence stretches. The nervous system no longer delays its own rhythm to accommodate the field. This is a profound reversal. Within mirror linguistic field theory, breath is not merely physiological. It is temporal sovereignty. When breath is uninterrupted, the body is no longer syncing its timing to external linguistic cadence. It is restoring its own rhythm. This restoration tells the nervous system, I do not need to pause myself to remain safe. Energy containment follows. Under accommodation, energy flows outward early. Attention tracks tone, microsignals, and implications. The body projects itself into the field, preparing to adapt before a request is even made. Boundary reverses this vector. Energy stays inside the body longer. Sensation is consulted before response. There is a subtle delay, not hesitation, but checking. The nervous system begins to reference its own state before mirroring the environment. This is the somatic expression of the ineffable gap returning, not as defense, but as space. In mirror linguistic hypothesis terms, the gap is where signal differentiation occurs. When the boundary is absent, the gap collapses. Language moves directly into physiology. The body executes scripts embedded in tone, implication, and expectation. Boundary reopens the gap, not by pushing back, but by not collapsing inward. One of the clearest signs that this shift is occurring is what happens after contact. In boundaryless states, interaction often ends in collapse. Fatigue arrives suddenly. The body needs distance to recover because it has been operating as an extension of the field, rather than as a self-regulating system. With a boundary present, recovery is no longer urgent. The body exits interaction with coherence intact. Energy remains available. There is less compulsion to withdraw, distract, or numb. This is not because the interaction was benign, but because the nervous system did not surrender its organization during it. From a neurobiological standpoint, this reflects vagal tone stabilization. The vagus nerve governs the capacity to remain socially engaged without entering threat states. Under chronic appeasement, vagal signaling becomes erratic, engagement is mixed with subtle freeze and collapse. Boundary restores vagal continuity. The system can engage and remain anchored. It no longer needs to oscillate between connection and self-protection. Interoceptive confidence strengthens as well. Interoception, the sensing of internal bodily states, is often suppressed in high-influence fields. Signals are felt but deprioritized. The body learns that its own data is less relevant than external meaning. Boundary reverses this hierarchy. Internal sensation regains authority. The body's signals are no longer immediately overridden by linguistic framing or relational pressure. This does not make the person reactive. It makes them accurate. Within the mirror linguistic hypothesis, this is the restoration of signal precedence. Sensation before language, physiology before narrative. As this happens, the brain's salience network recalibrates. Under influence, salience is externally driven. Everything feels important. Everything demands a response. The system remains in a constant state of readiness. Boundary reduces false salience. Some cues stop registering as urgent. Some demands no longer penetrate. Some conversations lose their gravitational pull. This is not avoidance. It is discernment preparing to emerge. Neuroplastically, this change occurs through repetition, not insight. Each time, the body maintains tone instead of collapsing. Each time, the breath continues instead of pausing. Each time, energy stays contained instead of projecting outward. The nervous system updates its predictive models. Contact does not require submission. Language does not automatically outrank sensation. The field cannot reorganize me without my participation. This is a boundary at the biological level. It often feels quiet, unspectacular, even slightly unfamiliar. Many people expect boundaries to feel assertive or empowering. Instead, it often feels like not doing something you used to do automatically. Not leaning forward, not explaining, not filling space. This can be unsettling at first because for a long time, movement was safety. But as the body relearns that stillness and containment do not invite harm, the edge stabilizes. Boundary in this sense is not resistance. It is self-continuity. It is the nervous system staying organized by its own signals while remaining in contact with the world. This is the return of edge, not as armor, not as dominance, not as separation, but as form within the field. In the next section, we will ground this physiology in lived experience, how this returning edge expresses itself in real situations where choice replaces reactivity, and how note often arrives internally long before it ever needs to be spoken. Field case study. When engagement becomes optional, there is a moment that often goes unnoticed, not because it is insignificant, but because it is quiet. It happens when an invitation arrives, a message, a request, a pull, and something in the body does not move toward it. There is no tightening, no rush to reply, no internal rehearsal of how to respond correctly. Just a pause, and then nothing happens. For many people, this moment feels unfamiliar enough to be mistaken for avoidance. But what is actually occurring is far more precise. The nervous system is no longer assuming obligation as the default response to contact. This is a boundary expressed not as refusal, but as optionality. In earlier phases of the resonance matrix, particularly throughout Volume 2, engagement was often compulsory. Language, tone, urgency, and implied consequence organized behavior automatically. The field spoke first, and the body responded. Silence felt dangerous. Delay felt risky. Not replying felt like provocation. But as the boundary returns, that contract dissolves. Engagement becomes a choice again. This shift is most clearly felt not in dramatic confrontations, but in everyday moments that once carried invisible pressure. A message arrives that previously would have required an immediate response. The body notices it, but does not mobilize. There is no spike in anxiety, no compulsion to explain. The message simply exists. An invitation is extended, social, professional, and emotional, and the nervous system registers it without leaning forward. There is no internal scramble to evaluate tone, anticipate expectations, or manage perception. The invitation lands, and the body remains where it is, and nothing collapses. This is a crucial reframe. For a long time, many people learned that non-response equaled rupture. Silence meant danger. Delay meant punishment. Withdrawal meant abandonment, either of the other or of oneself. These associations were not invented. They were learned in environments where engagement was necessary for survival, approval, or stability. Within MLH field theory, This is understood as field-conditioned compliance. The nervous system learns that linguistic signals, requests, implications, and invitations carry embedded survival cues. To ignore them feels unsafe, even when no explicit threat is present. Boundary interrupts this pattern not by resisting the field, but by no longer treating every signal as requiring execution. The body learns that it can receive information without reorganizing around it. This is where the field case study truly begins. Consider a person who has spent years adapting themselves to relational, institutional, or emotional pressure. They have learned to read between the lines, anticipate needs, smooth tension, and remain available. Engagement was not just interaction, it was regulation. Now imagine that same person post-thaw, post-discernment, with the boundary beginning to stabilize. They receive a familiar pull, a subtle guilt-laced request, an emotionally loaded invitation, a conversational opening that once would have drawn them in automatically. But something is different. The nervous system does not preemptively activate. There is no surge of justification, no internal dialogue saying I should respond, I owe something, this will escalate if I don't. Instead, there is a neutral noticing. This is not numbness. Sensation is present, but it is not being overridden by urgency, and so the person does nothing, not out of spite, not out of withdrawal, not as a strategy. They simply do not move. What follows is often surprising. Nothing breaks. The relationship does not implode. The system does not punish them. The field does not collapse into chaos. Sometimes the invitation passes. Sometimes the other person adjusts. Sometimes the moment dissolves without consequence. This is when a deep recalibration occurs. The nervous system registers a new data point. I can remain intact without responding. This is boundary learning at the level of lived experience. Within the mirror linguistic hypothesis, this moment represents a shift in the mirroring hierarchy. The body is no longer reflexively mirroring the field's demands. Instead, it mirrors its own internal state first, and only engages externally if coherence is maintained. This is why boundaries often appear as non-participation, not silence as protest, silence as accuracy. There is another layer here that deserves careful attention. For people conditioned by high-influence fields, engagement was often framed as virtue. Responsiveness equals care, availability equaled maturity, saying yes equaled safety. Silence was framed as passive-aggressive, dismissive, or irresponsible. A boundary disrupts these moral overlays. The body begins to recognize that engagement is not inherently good, and non-engagement is not inherently harmful. What matters is whether participation preserves internal coherence. This is why edge can return without explanation. In earlier phases, not explaining would have felt dangerous. Explanation was used to manage perception, prevent misunderstanding, or preempt conflict. But as the boundary stabilizes, explanation becomes optional rather than compulsory. The nervous system no longer assumes that it must justify its own limits to remain safe. This does not mean communication disappears. It means it is no longer driven by fear. Another common scenario unfolds here. The person begins to notice that they can stay present while not filling space. In conversations, they no longer rush to respond. They allow silence to exist without rushing to resolve it. They do not immediately mirror emotional tone. They remain steady. This steadiness often feels strange to others, not because it is hostile, but because it is unfamiliar. In systems that rely on constant mirroring to maintain equilibrium, a person who does not automatically engage introduces a new frequency. And this is where mirror linguistic field theory becomes particularly relevant. Fields are regulated by participation. When someone withdraws automatic engagement, the field must reorganize. Sometimes this leads to healthier dynamics. Sometimes it reveals an imbalance that was previously hidden by accommodation. But from the perspective of the person holding the boundary, the key experience is this: they are no longer responsible for stabilizing the field. They can remain present without managing the outcome. This is a radical shift. Boundary, in this sense, is not about saying no more often. It is about not saying yes prematurely. It is about allowing invitations to exist without obligation. It is about letting requests remain unanswered until the body registers congruence. And often, the most powerful boundary is not verbal at all. It is the moment when nothing is done, and the nervous system remains regulated anyway. This is why not responding can be the boundary. Within the mirror linguistic hypothesis, language has enormous regulatory power, but so does the absence of language. Silence interrupts linguistic entrainment. It creates a pause in which the body can maintain its own rhythm, rather than synchronizing to external cadence. This pause is not emptiness, it is containment. Many people fear that if they do not engage, they will be perceived as cold, uncaring, or withdrawn. But what actually happens over time is that relationships reorganize around clarity. Those that required constant accommodation often fall away. Those who can tolerate the edge begin to adapt. And importantly, the person holding the boundary does not have to manage this process consciously. They simply stop participating automatically. This is why boundary feels so different from defense. Defense is effortful. It requires vigilance, strategy, and anticipation. A boundary is effortless once it stabilizes, because it is simply the body remaining with itself. In this field case study, the most important shift is not behavioral, it is internal permission. Permission to not respond. Permission to let invitations pass. Permission to allow silence, and the nervous system learns, slowly and gently, that safety no longer depends on constant participation. This is the moment engagement becomes optional, not because the world is rejected, but because the self is no longer abandoned. In the next section, we will look at how language adapts to this change, how words return after edge, how naming becomes descriptive rather than defensive, and how the ineffable gap, once a shield, becomes a natural space where preference forms. For now, let this register. Boundary does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply looks like nothing is happening, and nothing is falling apart. That is not absence. That is coherence holding its shape. Language and boundary. When explanation is no longer required, there is a point at which language begins to soften again, not because it has lost meaning, but because it is no longer being used as protection. For many people, words became a substitute for boundaries long before boundary was felt in the body. Explanation was used where the edge was missing. Clarification filled the space where containment had not yet formed. Language was asked to do the work that the nervous system could not yet sustain on its own, and for a time, this made sense. When contact felt unsafe, language became the bridge. When refusal felt dangerous, explanation became the shield. When saying no felt impossible, justification offered a way to remain connected without collapsing entirely. But as boundary returns to the body, something subtle begins to change. Words no longer arrive first, they follow. This is the pivot point. A boundary does not strengthen through better phrasing. It strengthens when the body no longer requires language to remain in contact. When that happens, explanation loses its urgency. Speech becomes optional. Silence becomes neutral. Presence no longer needs to be defended. This is not a withdrawal, it is containment. Within the framework of the mirror linguistic hypothesis, language mirrors the state before it transmits meaning. When the nervous system is regulated, language becomes economical. It stops circling, it stops preempting, it stops negotiating permission to exist. Boundary restores language by relieving it of a burden it was never meant to carry. For a long time, many people learned that if they did not explain themselves, something would go wrong. Misunderstanding would escalate, conflict would follow, rejection would occur. Explanation became a preventative measure, a way to manage the field before it reacted. This created a specific linguistic posture, anticipatory speech. Sentences were formed not to express truth, but to avoid consequences. Words were chosen to soften the impact, reassure the other, and preempt misinterpretation. Language was stretched thin, carrying emotional labor that the body could not yet contain. In such conditions, the boundary weakens when over-explained, not because explanation is inherently wrong, but because it positions the speaker as accountable for the other's comfort. The moment a boundary requires justification to be valid, it ceases to be a boundary. It becomes a negotiation. As the boundary stabilizes, the nervous system begins to recognize this distinction. It notices that over-explaining drains energy, that elaboration pulls attention outward, that justifying presence subtly reopens the door to self-abandonment, and so gradually, language reorganizes itself around the edge rather than fear. This is where the ineffable gap changes function. In earlier phases of influence and override, the gap between stimulus and response had to be protected deliberately. It was a defensive space, something to guard against intrusion. Silence was used strategically. Delay was used consciously. But as the boundary returns, the gap no longer needs to be defended. It becomes natural. The nervous system does not rush to fill space. It does not collapse into response. It allows sensation, preference, and orientation to settle before words appear. This is not hesitation. It is sequencing. Language that follows boundary sounds different. It is shorter, clearer, less apologetic. It does not explain why something is true before stating that it is true. And importantly, it does not attempt to manage how it will be received. This can feel disorienting at first, especially for those who were rewarded for articulation, emotional intelligence, or relational attunement. Letting go of explanation can feel like irresponsibility. Silence can feel like neglect. Brevity can feel like coldness. But these are learned associations, not intrinsic truths. The body is recalibrating its relationship to language. Within MLH field theory, this recalibration is understood as a shift in linguistic authority. The authority of language moves from external regulation to internal coherence. Words are no longer shaped primarily by the field's expectations. They are shaped by the body's settled state. This has profound consequences. When language is no longer used to justify presence, presence becomes self-validating. The person no longer feels compelled to convince others of their right to pause, decline, or disengage. Boundary holds without explanation. This does not eliminate communication. It purifies it. Words become descriptive rather than defensive. A simple no longer feels abrupt. A pause no longer feels like failure. Silence no longer signals withdrawal. It signals self-contact. This is why boundaries often emerge as fewer words. Not because there is less to say, but because there is less to manage. The nervous system no longer needs to modulate the field through speech. It trusts the edge it is holding, and trust changes tone. Another important shift occurs here. Language stops arriving as a reaction. In earlier stages, speech was often triggered by discomfort. Something felt off, and language rushed in to repair, soothe, or explain. But as the boundary stabilizes, discomfort no longer demands immediate translation. The body can hold it without collapsing. This allows language to arrive late, or not at all, and when it does arrive, it carries a different quality. It is not trying to persuade. It is not trying to defend. It is not trying to prove. It simply states, This simplicity can feel radical in environments accustomed to over-communication. In systems where value is assigned through responsiveness, clarity without elaboration can feel unsettling. But this reaction belongs to the field, not the individual. A boundary does not require approval to function. Within the MLH lens, this is where language stops being a regulatory tool and returns to being a mirror. It reflects what is already stable, rather than attempting to stabilize what is not. The words that emerge from the boundary tend to be grounded in present orientation, rather than narrative justification. They reference current capacity, not history. They name limits without apology. I'm not available for that. I'm going to step back. I'm choosing not to engage. These statements do not explain why, because the body no longer requires the explanation to remain intact. This does not mean explanations never occur. It means they are no longer obligatory, and obligation is the key distinction. When explanation is optional, language becomes honest. When explanation is required, language becomes strategic. Boundary restores honesty by restoring choice. There is another layer here that often goes unnoticed. As language simplifies, listening deepens. The person holding boundaries becomes more selective, not only in what they say, but in what they receive. They no longer absorb every word as a directive. They do not mirror tone reflexively. They allow language to pass through, rather than lodge inside. This is containment in action. The field may still speak loudly. Requests may still arrive with urgency. Narratives may still attempt to recruit attention. But the nervous system no longer treats language as an immediate instruction. It receives, it pauses, it decides, and often it decides to do nothing. This is why boundary is so destabilizing to fields that rely on automatic linguistic entrainment. When someone no longer reacts to tone, implication, or urgency, the field loses leverage. But from the inside, it does not feel like resistance. It feels like relief. Not relief from pressure, but relief from obligation. This is also why boundaries often arrive with grief. Letting go of explanation can feel like letting go of a role. The role of mediator, translator, emotional manager, the person who made things smooth. As language becomes quieter, the identity built around communication softens. This can feel like a loss, but what is actually being released is labor that was never meant to be permanent. A boundary gives language a place to rest, and when language rests, presence strengthens. The ineffable gap, the space between stimulus and response, no longer needs to be guarded because it is no longer under threat. It exists as a natural pause, a moment of internal check-in, where the body confirms coherence before expression. This is not a delay for delay's sake. It is orientation before articulation. In this state, language becomes precise not through effort, but through alignment. Words arrive when they are needed and remain absent when they are not. Silence is not a tactic. It is simply the absence of unnecessary speech. This is how boundary restores language, not by adding rules, not by perfecting phrasing, but by removing the demand that language justify existence. In the next section, we will shift from language to practice, not as technique, but as observation. We will explore how discernment and boundaries can be noticed in real time without being turned into tasks, goals, or identities. Observation practice noticing edge without enforcing it. This practice is not about changing behavior. It is not about asserting boundaries, correcting dynamics, or making decisions. It is about allowing the nervous system to register the edge without being overridden by action. For many people, boundary has been learned as something that must be done, spoken, defended, enforced, or justified. As a result, the body rarely gets the chance to complete its own internal process of containment before the mind intervenes. This section exists to reverse that order. Boundary begins as a physiological event long before it becomes language or behavior. This practice simply asks you to notice that event, and then leave it alone. The first invitation, notice protective tightening. Begin by noticing where the body tightens protectively in moments of contact. This tightening is rarely dramatic. It does not announce itself as fear or anger. More often, it is subtle. A slight contraction in the abdomen, a narrowing behind the eyes, a holding in the jaw, a quiet lift in the shoulders, a shallow pause in the breath. These are not signs of anxiety to be fixed. They are signs of containment attempting to return. The nervous system is adjusting its perimeter. It is deciding quietly and efficiently how much contact is tolerable in this moment. In many people, this tightening has been pathologized. It has been interpreted as tension, defensiveness, or a failure to relax. As a result, the reflex to soften, override, or push through appears almost immediately. This practice asks you not to do that. Do not relax the tightening deliberately. Do not exaggerate it. Do not interpret it. Simply notice that it is there. This tightening is not aggression. It is not withdrawal. It is edge forming internally. The second invitation, notice energy withdrawal next. Notice where energy begins to withdraw. Energy withdrawal is often misunderstood. It is not dissociation, collapse, or avoidance. It does not feel like shutting down. Instead, it feels like lessening. Less desire to explain, less pull to respond, less urgency to participate, less emotional reach. Attention turns inward slightly. Engagement becomes optional rather than automatic. This is not apathy. It is selectively returning. In survival-based systems, relational, cultural, or professional, constant engagement is often required to maintain stability. Energy withdrawal is therefore misread as irresponsibility, avoidance, or rudeness. From a nervous system perspective, however, energy withdrawal is often the first sign of restored choice. The body is learning that it does not need to offer itself continuously to remain safe. This practice asks you to notice that withdrawal without acting on it. You do not need to disengage. You do not need to leave. You do not need to respond differently. Just notice that the pull has softened. The core practice observe edge without turning it into behavior. This is the point where most people struggle, not because the practice is complex, but because it contradicts deeply learned survival strategies. When an edge appears, the mind wants to do something. It wants to set a boundary verbally. It wants to withdraw physically. It wants to explain, justify, clarify, or resolve. But edge does not require immediate expression to be real. In fact, premature expression often destabilizes the boundary before it has fully formed. This is where the mirror linguistic hypothesis offers a quiet but essential insight. Language and action should follow the state, not attempt to manufacture it. If the nervous system is still calibrating its perimeter, forcing edge into words or behavior can pull the system back into the very field it is trying to regulate against. Observation allows the edge to consolidate internally. This practice is not suppression. It is non-interference. You are letting the body complete a process it has often been interrupted from finishing. Why this works: the science layer. When an edge is noticed but not overridden, the nervous system begins to reinforce containment pathways. As interoceptive confidence increases, the brain learns that internal signals can be registered without requiring immediate correction or justification. This is neuroplastic learning. Each time you notice tightening or withdrawal, and do not override it, predictive models in the brain update. The system learns. Edge does not automatically lead to danger. Containment does not require confrontation. Presence does not require performance over time. Baseline stress load decreases. This is not because the environment has changed, but because the body is no longer mobilizing unnecessarily. Much chronic stress is produced not by external demand, but by internal override, the constant effort of managing reactions, explaining oneself, or staying open past capacity. When the edge is honored silently, cortisol output reduces. Vagal tone stabilizes. Containment becomes a resting state rather than a defensive posture. Why this practice can feel uncomfortable at first for people who survive through appeasement, over-accommodation, or emotional labor. Not acting on edge can feel unsafe. The mind may produce warnings. If you don't respond, something will go wrong. If you don't explain, you'll be misunderstood. If you don't manage this, you'll lose connection. These are not present moment signals. They are memory-based predictions. This practice allows the nervous system to learn something new, that edge can exist without consequence. You are not withdrawing the connection. You are restoring containment. Explanation pulls you back into the field. Enforcement can harden the boundary before it is stable. Noticing allows the system to organize itself internally. This is not passivity. It is sequencing. The boundary stabilizes before it expresses. What changes over time with repetition? The edge becomes clearer and less effortful. The body no longer needs to tighten as strongly to signal its limits. Energy withdrawal becomes smoother, less charged. Language, when it eventually arrives, is simpler and grounded. But none of that is required now. For this section, the only invitation is this. Notice where your body tightens protectively. Notice where energy withdraws. Observe the edge without turning it into behavior. Let the body learn that it can hold itself without explanation. A boundary does not begin with action. It begins with allowing the edge to exist quietly, internally, and without apology. Self-reflection prompt. This is not a question to solve. It is not an instruction to analyze your behavior or revise your past. It is a moment of internal contact. Let the body answer before the mind intervenes. One question only. Where do I feel myself pull back and usually override it? You may notice this pullback in places that seem small or ordinary. A pause before replying. A hesitation before agreeing. A subtle tightening when attention turns toward you. A moment where energy recedes and is quickly pushed forward again. There is no need to trace it to a memory. No need to decide whether it is right or wrong. No need to correct it or follow it. Simply notice that it exists. This question is not asking why you override it. It is not asking what you should do differently. It is inviting you to recognize the moment when the body signals enough, and the system moves past that signal automatically. If an answer arises, let it arise quietly. If nothing arises, that is also information. Let the question sit where the edge begins, not as a demand, but as an opening. Boundary strengthens first through recognition, not action, and recognition does not require movement. Integration boundary preserves signal. A boundary is often misunderstood because it is felt before it is understood, and anything felt before it is understood tends to be mistrusted. For many people, boundary carries the emotional residue of conflict, rupture, or rejection. It is associated with raised voices, hardened stances, ultimatums, or distance, but that association is not inherent to the boundary itself. It is inherited from moments where the boundary was introduced too late, under pressure, or in defense. What you are restoring here is not that version. Boundary in its primary form is not separation, it is stabilization. It is the nervous system recognizing that something valuable has returned, sensation, orientation, discernment, and adjusting contact, so that this signal is not lost again. This is the crucial reframe for this episode, and for the entire arc you are now moving through. You don't protect yourself with a boundary, you protect what has returned. In earlier phases of the journey, particularly in Volume 2, a boundary could not exist. not because you failed to set it, but because there was nothing stable inside to anchor it. When the system is overridden, when language edits sensation, when urgency dominates, any attempt at boundary becomes either brittle or explosive. A boundary without a signal becomes a defense. A boundary without internal coherence becomes control. A boundary without orientation becomes rigid. But now something is different. Stillness has restored capacity. Sensation has returned without instruction. Orientation has given those sensations a place to land. Discernment has begun separating signal from noise. Boundary emerges after all of this, not as an act of will, but as a natural consequence of coherence. One of the reasons a boundary feels unfamiliar at this stage is that it does not arrive as a decision, it arrives as non-movement. A moment where the body does not lean forward, a moment where energy stays inside instead of extending outward, a pause where explanation does not rush into smooth contact. Nothing dramatic happens, and that is the point. Boundary preserves the signal by reducing unnecessary exposure, not exposure to danger, but exposure to distortion. From a nervous system perspective, a boundary is the regulation of contact. Contact is not just physical proximity. It is attentional, emotional, linguistic, and energetic. Every interaction places demands on the system. In earlier phases, those demands were met automatically through appeasement, urgency, performance, or collapse. Now the system is learning something new. It does not have to meet every demand. This learning is not cognitive. It is somatic and predictive. The body begins to notice that when it does less, it actually retains more breath, more clarity, more continuity of self after interaction. A boundary here is not a line drawn against the world. It is a container that keeps the signal intact during engagement. This is why the common reframes matter so deeply. A boundary is not equal to conflict, a boundary is not equal to punishment, and a boundary is not equal to withdrawal. Let's slow each one down. A boundary is not in conflict because it does not require opposition. Conflict arises when two forces collide. The boundary at this stage prevents collision by modulating proximity before impact. A boundary is not punishment because it is not reactive. It does not arrive after harm to teach a lesson. It arrives before harm as a quiet adjustment in contact. A boundary is not a withdrawal because the system is not leaving. It is staying, but staying with itself. This is subtle and it matters. Withdrawal removes presence. Boundary preserves presence. From the perspective of the mirror linguistic hypothesis, a boundary represents a shift in how the field is mirrored internally. Earlier, the field dominated the mirror. External signals shaped the internal state faster than the body could register them. Language, expectation, urgency, and relational pressure all edited sensation before it could stabilize. Now the mirror is recalibrating. Internal signal is reflected to itself before being projected outward. This creates a temporal buffer, not the defensive ineffable gap of volume 2, but a stabilizing space where the signal can settle. The boundary is what maintains that buffer, not by force, by pacing. MLH field theory helps clarify why the boundary does not need explanation. In a regulated field, coherence speaks before language. Other systems can sense stability without being told, but in dysregulated fields, explanation is demanded because coherence is absent. When you over-explain a boundary, it often collapses, not because explanation is wrong, but because explanation re-enters a field that cannot yet tolerate difference. A boundary at this stage works best when it remains pre-linguistic. A shorter reply, a slower response, a decision not to clarify, a choice not to enter a familiar dynamic. These are not strategies. They are expressions of preserved signal. One of the most disorienting parts of boundary integration is the emotional response that can follow. Guilt, unease, a sense of doing nothing wrong but feeling wrong anyway. This does not mean the boundary is incorrect. It means the nervous system is outgrowing an old predictive model. For a long time, safety may have depended on availability, on responsiveness, on being interpretable, agreeable, reachable. Boundary interrupts that model. The system initially flags this interruption as risk, not because danger is present, but because predictability has changed. This is why boundary feels like selfishness before it feels like coherence. And this is why boundary must be integrated slowly, without forcing meaning onto it. Neurobiologically, what is happening here is a recalibration of salience. The salience network, which determines what matters and what can be ignored, begins to prioritize internal continuity over external demand. This reduces cognitive load, it reduces stress physiology, it reduces post-interaction depletion. But it can feel unfamiliar because the system is no longer running on urgency or appeasement. Instead, it is running on relevance. Boundary is relevance made visible. There is another subtle but important integration point here. A boundary is not something you apply to people. It is something you maintain within yourself. This shifts the entire frame. If the boundary is applied outward, it becomes behavioral and reactive. If the boundary is maintained inward, it becomes stabilizing and quiet. You don't need others to understand your boundary for it to function. You only need to stay with the signal that the boundary is preserving. This is why the explanation weakens the boundary at this stage. It hands authority back to the field too early. As boundary integrates, you may notice something unexpected. Your tolerance for noise decreases, not because you are less resilient, but because you are more coherent. What once felt manageable now feels unnecessary. What once felt normal now feels draining. This is not regression, it is refinement. Discernment revealed a difference. The boundary protects differences, and protected difference allows the signal to remain a signal, rather than being flattened into compliance. Boundaries also change how trust functions. Earlier, trust may have been extended by default and revoked painfully. Now, trust becomes contextual. It grows where the signal remains intact. It recedes where signal fragments. This is not suspicion. It is an orientation applied to a relationship. Boundary allows trust to be earned somatically, not granted conceptually. Perhaps the most important integration to hold is this: a boundary does not make you harder, it makes you less porous to distortion. You are not closing, you are consolidating, and consolidation is what allows the next phase to begin, not retreat, but participation. Because without a boundary, participation collapses into exposure, and with a boundary, participation becomes reciprocal. So if the boundary feels quiet, uneventful, or almost disappointing, let that be information. The boundary is not meant to feel powerful. It is meant to feel settling. It does not announce itself. It simply prevents what no longer needs to happen, and in doing so, it preserves what took so long to return. Signal. The boundary is not the end of engagement. It is the condition that makes engagement possible without collapse. Up to this point in Volume 3, the work has been quiet, internal, almost invisible. Stillness restored capacity. Sensation returned without instruction. Orientation gave experience a place to land. Discernment separated the signal from the noise. The boundary protected what had returned so it could remain intact. Now something subtle begins to happen. Space appears, not space that is a void, not silence as withdrawal, but space as availability without pressure. This is the moment where many people expect something dramatic to occur, a declaration, a decision, a statement of self. But voice does not arrive that way. When it does, it often collapses back into performance. Real voice returns differently. It returns because there is finally somewhere safe for it to land. A boundary does not create distance for its own sake. It creates containment. And containment changes how expression forms. Without edge, expression spills. With too much edge, expression freezes. But when edge is held quietly and consistently, something else becomes possible. Expression without defense. This is why voice comes after boundary, not before. Before the boundary, voice is forced. Before the boundary, voice is justified. Before the boundary, voice is shaped to manage reaction. After the boundary, voice does not need to manage anything. It can arrive unannounced. Many people mistake voice for speaking. But speaking can occur in the absence of voice, rehearsed, adaptive, strategic. Voice, as this series understands it, is not volume or confidence. It is not persuasion or articulation. It is the alignment between the internal signal and outward expression. Voice emerges when the nervous system no longer needs to protect itself through silence or performance. Boundary makes that possible by doing something essential. It limits the field enough that expression does not have to scan for danger before it forms. In earlier phases of life, expression may have been unsafe. Words may have been corrected, dismissed, used against you, or required justification. In those environments, silence was adaptive. Performance was protective. Voice had to wait. What boundary does now is not demand speech. It simply removes the conditions that once made speech costly. That removal is what opens the doorway. You may notice that as the boundary stabilizes, expression changes before you consciously decide to speak. Sentences become shorter, words become simpler, tone becomes less managed. You say less and mean more. This is not a restraint. It is coherence. A boundary gives voice a frame. And when a signal has a frame, it no longer needs to amplify itself to be heard. This is why the next episode is not about finding your voice in the motivational sense. It is about recognizing when voice returns naturally, without urgency, without performance, without explanation. Voice returns only where the edge is held. Without edge, expression leaks into appeasement. Without edge, expression becomes defense. Without edge, expression becomes noise. But with edge, expression can be precise without being sharp, present without being loud, honest without being exposed. This is the terrain episode 6 enters. Episode 6, the voice, expression without performance. In the next episode, we will explore what happens when expression is no longer shaped by survival reflexes. We will look at how the nervous system releases the need to manage perception, how language begins to follow a signal rather than override it, and how the ineffable gap, once a defensive space, becomes a place of creative emergence. Voice is not something you push outward. It is something that rises when there is room. The boundary created that room. So as we close this episode, thank you for entering this field of exploration. The resonance matrix is not something you escape. It is something you learn to feel and perceive. Once you begin to recognize the field through sensation, orientation, and self-awareness, perception becomes less governed by urgency and more guided by coherence. Until next time, you've been listening to The Resonance Matrix, Volume 3, Silencing the Field, Return to Self, Episode 5, Boundary, The Return to the Edge. I'm James Miller.